"Please marry my mother, mister. She's all I've got left," begged the little girl. A plea uttered in the cold, biting wind, shattering the illusion of quiet solitude a lone man sought. It was a whisper from a child, thin and desperate, that hooked into Elias's very soul. A barbed line in the churning waters of his own fractured existence. The words hung in the frigid air, shimmering with the raw fragility of youth confronting the merciless world. He had seen suffering before, had walked away from it countless times, but this was different. This small voice, belonging to a girl no older than 8, pierced through the hardened shell he had meticulously built around himself. A fortress against feeling, against responsibility, against the haunting echoes of his own past. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly direct, held an ancient grief, a wisdom born of premature hardship that no child should ever carry. They reflected the bleak, unyielding landscape of their shared poverty, the shadowed doorways of the village that offered no warmth, no solace. Elias, a man etched by the sun and the dust of forgotten roads, felt an unfamiliar tremor deep within him. His clothes, worn and threadbare, offered little protection against the chill, much like his heart, which he believed had long ago grown impervious to such appeals. But the girl's plea was not an appeal, it was a demand, a desperate, unvarnished truth laid bare. Her small hand, chapped and reddened by the cold, reached out, not quite touching him, but extending an invisible tether that bound them in that moment. The street, usually bustling with the hurried indifference of daily life, seemed to hold its breath, every shadow stretching, listening. He saw the mother then, a spectral figure leaning against the worn wooden frame of a doorway, her face a canvas of exhaustion and quiet despair, her eyes mirroring the child's silent plea, a profound weariness etched into every line. This was not a theatrical display. This was the raw, guttural cry of survival. It was a tableau of human vulnerability, stark against the indifferent backdrop of a world struggling to find its footing, a world that often forgot its most fragile inhabitants. The very air around them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken anguish and the crushing weight of circumstance. For Elias, every breath was a calculation, every decision a maneuver to avoid entanglement, to remain an untraceable phantom. Yet this child, this mother, had conjured him from the shadows with a single, devastating sentence. The desperate hope in the child's plea, the silent suffering of the mother, formed a potent, undeniable current that pulled at the very foundations of his solitary existence. He was a man accustomed to leaving, to never looking back, but something in the unblinking purity of the child's gaze held him captive. A silent challenge laid at his feet, daring him to turn away. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The words echoed in Elias's mind, a rhythmic drumbeat against the fortress walls of his self-imposed isolation. "Please marry my mother, mister." It was an absurd request, yet it resonated with a brutal, undeniable logic in the child's world. He was a stranger, a vagabond, a man whose presence usually inspired suspicion, not pleas for matrimony. His gaze drifted from the girl, Lily, to the woman, Sarah, who remained silent, her eyes downcast, a figure of profound resignation. She made no move to correct her daughter, no attempt to retract the embarrassing, desperate utterance. This quiet acceptance, this palpable sense of utter defeat, struck Elias harder than any direct appeal. It spoke of a depth of despair he instinctively recognized, a hopelessness that mirrored parts of his own shadowed past. He saw the subtle tremble in her hands, the way she clutched the worn fabric of her apron, as if holding on to the last vestiges of her dignity. A memory, fleeting but sharp, cut through him. The image of a broken fence, splintered and rotting, a futile barrier against a relentless storm. That was her, perhaps. That was them. He had always been the storm, or the one who observed it from a safe distance. He considered the sheer audacity of the request, the societal implications. Marriage for them was a sacrament, a covenant, not a convenient fiction. What would the villagers say? The thought of it, of being shackled to another's burden, another's misery, churned in his gut like stagnant water. His first instinct, sharp and immediate, was to turn, to walk away, to dissolve back into the anonymity of the road that had been his only true companion for years. He had honed the art of disengagement, of shedding responsibility like an old skin. But Lily's small, persistent presence, her unblinking stare, held him anchored. It was as if she saw through the layers of his hardened exterior, directly into the soft, unscarred core he fiercely guarded. He was a man of shadows, of untold stories, of choices made in the crucible of desperation that had left indelible marks upon his soul. The scars he carried were not just physical, they were etched into his very being, testament to a life lived on the fringes, always just one step ahead of consequence. He remembered the cold comfort of solitude, the freedom of having nothing to lose, nothing to protect. This request threatened to dismantle it all, brick by painstaking brick. Yet there was an unfamiliar pull, a strange magnetic force drawing him towards this improbable intersection of lives. It was the irony of it, perhaps. A man who had fled all attachments being asked to forge the most intimate one. Or perhaps it was the sheer, unadulterated vulnerability of the child, a stark contrast to the cynical world he inhabited. The air grew heavier, thick with unspoken questions, unanswered pleas. He was a man of few words, and now, even those failed him. His silence hung in the air, a vast, imposing wall between their desperate hope and his ingrained reluctance. It was not kindness that held him, not yet, but a strange, unsettling curiosity, a challenge to his own hardened philosophy. He felt the weight of their gaze, a burden he had long avoided, settling on his shoulders like a shroud. The silence stretched, taut and trembling, until Elias, with a sigh that seemed to deflate the very air around him, finally spoke. His voice, rough from disuse, was a low rumble, barely audible above the whisper of the wind. "And what precisely would that achieve, child?" It was not a question seeking an answer, but an expression of his own internal battle, a cynical query against a backdrop of raw, unvarnished hope. Lily, however, took it as an invitation. Her small voice, imbued with a conviction that belied her years, explained their plight. A debt, a threat of eviction, the brutal reality of their impending destitution. They said Mother needs a man, to make it right, to keep us in the house. Her words were simple, devoid of embellishment, a stark outline of their desperate situation. Sarah remained silent, her gaze fixed on the ground, but Elias could feel the tremor of her unspoken plea, a desperate current beneath the surface of her still form. He saw the judgmental glances from passing villagers, quick furtive looks of pity mixed with condemnation. They were stereotypical societal figures, embodying the collective gaze that often weighed heaviest on the most vulnerable. There was the stout woman clutching a basket, her lips thinned in disapproval. The old man with a cane, shaking his head slowly, a silent verdict of their perceived failure. Elias felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of protectiveness, not for the mother or the child, but for the stark, brutal honesty of their predicament against the backdrop of such small-minded judgment. He, too, was an outcast, intimately familiar with the sting of societal scorn. He could not deny the stark, undeniable truth of their need. The thought of Lily and her mother being cast out, left to wander the cold, unforgiving streets, resonated with a chilling familiarity. He had known such bleakness. He remembered a time, long ago, when he himself had stood at the precipice of utter ruin, when a single, desperate hand could have pulled him back from the brink, but none had appeared. He remembered the biting wind, the gnawing hunger, the hollow ache of being utterly alone. This memory, a shard of his own past, seemed to splinter his resolve, allowing a faint, almost imperceptible crack in his carefully constructed cynicism. A marriage of convenience, then? He murmured, more to himself than to them. His eyes met Sarah's then, truly met them, and he saw not just despair but a flickering intelligence, a weariness that spoke volumes of struggles endured, battles fought and lost. There was no artifice in her gaze, only a raw, pleading vulnerability. It was a silent acknowledgement, a desperate gamble. He was a dangerous proposition, a gamble in itself. Yet, what did she have left to lose? He had nothing to gain, only another burden, another set of eyes to witness his flaws. But the child's small hand, still outstretched, seemed to weigh more than all the burdens of his past. A peculiar tension settled over him, the kind that precedes an irreversible decision. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this moment would forever alter the trajectory of his solitary life. He was a man who moved like a ghost, leaving no trace, but this choice, if he made it, would tether him, perhaps irrevocably, to a destiny he had so painstakingly avoided. He agreed. The word, a hoarse whisper from his lips, felt alien. A stone dropped into the quiet pond of his carefully maintained solitude, sending ripples he could not yet comprehend. There was no grand gesture, no swell of music, only the simple, blunt acceptance of an impossible proposal. A flicker of immense relief washed over Sarah's face, a momentary softening of the harsh lines etched by worry and fear. Lily, her small face aglow, released a breath she seemed to have been holding for an eternity. Her grasp on his coat sleeve, tentative before, became firm, an innocent claim. Elias felt the immediate weight of it, the unspoken expectations, the subtle shift in the air as their desperate hope settled onto him like a heavy shroud. This was not a true marriage, he reminded himself, but a charade, a fragile shield against the encroaching darkness of poverty and eviction. Pretense, a means to an end. But the eyes of the village, sharp and unforgiving, saw only the surface. The gossiping women, their whispers like rustling leaves, watched from behind lace curtains. The stern-faced shopkeeper, a pillar of the community, offered a curt nod, his gaze lingering with an unspoken question. These were the stereotypical figures, the silent judges who measured lives against their own narrow standards. They saw the drifter, the mysterious man, now inexplicably linked to the vulnerable widow and her child. Their scrutiny was a tangible thing, a constant pressure, pressing in on the fragile facade Elias was now forced to maintain. He felt the ironic bite of it. A man who had dedicated his life to avoiding scrutiny now found himself at the center of a small, curious storm. Inside the small, sparsely furnished cottage, the silence felt different, heavier, charged with a new, uncomfortable intimacy. There was the scent of stale bread and desperation, mixed now with the faint, unsettling aroma of his own presence, a foreign element in their quiet, desperate existence. Elias kept his distance, a silent, watchful sentinel in the corner of the small room. He observed Sarah moving with a quiet efficiency, her movements practiced and weary. He saw Lily, her eyes following him, a silent question in their depths. He tried to remain a shadow, an illusion, but the space was too small, the need too great. He was not a savior. He was a temporary solution, a living, breathing legal loophole. Yet the child's trust, so easily given, was a disquieting thing. It pricked at his conscience, a persistent splinter beneath his hardened skin. He was accustomed to suspicion, to fear, to indifference. This innocent belief was a foreign burden, one he did not know how to carry. He found himself, despite his best efforts, watching them, observing their quiet rituals, the small, desperate acts of survival. A single candle flickering against the encroaching darkness. A shared bowl of thin stew. The quiet rustle of old blankets. He had known hunger, cold, loneliness. But he had never known the quiet desperation of a family clinging to the last threads of their existence. This new reality, this manufactured domesticity, was a stark contrast to the untamed wilderness of his past. A past that still haunted him. A past he kept locked away, deep within the fractured chambers of his memory, waiting for the opportune moment to unleash its truth. Life under the same roof was a study in unspoken agreements and lingering suspicions. Elias moved with the quiet stealth of a predator, yet his presence, even when still, was a palpable weight in the cramped cottage. He maintained a guarded distance from Sarah, their interactions formal, terse, confined to the bare necessities of their shared charade. Each conversation was a delicate dance around the truth, a carefully constructed facade of normalcy for the benefit of Lily and the watchful eyes of the village. The air between them often felt thick with unspoken questions, with the heavy subtext of two strangers bound by an improbable pact. Yet, within this uneasy truce, a subtle shift began to occur. Elias, despite his efforts to remain detached, found himself drawn into the quiet rhythm of their days. He watched Lily, her small, resilient spirit a beacon in the gloom. He saw her tracing patterns on the dusty window pane, her imagination a vivid counterpoint to their bleak reality. And he saw Sarah, her quiet strength, her tireless efforts to provide, despite the gnawing fear that clung to her like a second skin. One bitter afternoon, a gust of wind ripped through the cottage's aging window frame, tearing away a loose pane. Without a word, Elias moved. His hands, calloused and strong, quickly and efficiently mended the breach, using a piece of salvaged wood he'd found. It was a small act unnoticed by Sarah, who was tending to a simmering pot on the hearth, her back turned. But Lily saw it. Her eyes, wide with a quiet awe, met his for a brief, fleeting moment. In that shared glance, a minuscule crack appeared in the wall Elias had erected around himself, a silent acknowledgement of a flicker of unexpected goodness. It was a testament to the slow-burn pacing of their forced intimacy, a rhythmic tension building that hinged on such subtle moments. Yet, even as fragile threads of something akin to trust began to form, the shadows of Elias's past loomed larger. A flashback, sharp and unwelcome, assaulted his mind. The glint of lamplight on cold steel, a desperate struggle, the metallic tang of fear and regret. It was a memory of a time when choices were few, and survival was paramount, a choice that had branded him, ensuring his moral ambiguity. He remembered the cold weight of a mistake, a desperate act born of necessity that had twisted his path, forcing him to flee, to become the ghost he now was. This inner turmoil, this constant battle with his own history, was his deepest flaw, a wound that never truly healed. The memory was brief, but its lingering chill was a constant reminder of why he could never truly belong, why this fragile domesticity was a dangerous illusion. The irony was not lost on him. He had sought refuge from a past that refused to be buried, only to find himself cornered by the innocent plea of a child, tethered to a family that unknowingly dragged him closer to the very dangers he had tried so desperately to outrun. The world outside the cottage remained oblivious to his internal torment, seeing only the enigma, the silent, brooding man who had inexplicably become the family's protector. The delicate dance of unspoken understanding between Elias and Sarah began to deepen, the subtle shift in their interactions becoming almost imperceptible to an outsider, yet profoundly felt by them both. Sarah, initially wary and resigned, started to observe Elias more closely. She saw the rough edges, yes, but also the meticulous way he secured the cottage against the elements, the quiet efficiency with which he chopped firewood, the unblinking watchfulness in his eyes. It wasn't love, not yet, but a growing, uneasy respect, born of necessity and a primal appreciation for his unexpected presence. She was a woman who had known betrayal, who had been buffeted by life's cruelest winds, and this stranger, despite his shadowy demeanor, offered a semblance of stability she hadn't known in years. Lily, unfettered by the complexities of adult cynicism, had fully embraced Elias, her innocent affection a constant, warm presence that pricked at his carefully constructed defenses. Her laughter, a fragile bell-like sound, was a balm to his scarred soul, slowly eroding the walls he had built around himself. He found himself, against his better judgment, responding to her, a rare, almost imperceptible softening in his gaze, a quiet acknowledgement of her simple, profound trust. The mundane rhythm of their days, once a tedious pretense, began to weave itself into a fragile tapestry of coexistence. But this fragile peace was a fleeting thing, a calm before an inevitable storm. The world outside, the one Elias had so desperately tried to escape, refused to be silenced. A shadow emerged, slowly at first, then with increasing clarity, threatening to unravel their tenuous existence. It began with whispers in the village, then a strange, unsettling presence lingering outside the cottage after dusk. A menacing figure, a man with cold, calculating eyes and a cruel twist to his lips, appeared one afternoon, his gaze fixing on Elias with a chilling recognition. This was Thomas, a ghost from Elias's past, a debt collector of a different kind, one who dealt in blood and broken promises. Thomas was a secondary character, a stereotypical figure of avarice and brutality, embodying the societal rot that often preyed on the desperate. His presence was a stark, tangible threat, a dark cloud gathering on their horizon. He represented the unresolved conflicts of Elias's past, a past he had painstakingly buried beneath layers of anonymity and distance. The tension in the cottage became a living thing, humming beneath the surface of their forced normalcy. Elias became more vigilant, his senses heightened. Every rustle of leaves, every distant dog bark, a potential harbinger of danger. Sarah, keenly attuned to the subtle shifts in his demeanor, felt the cold tendrils of fear begin to coil around her heart once more. The fragile hope that had begun to bloom now felt threatened, poised on the precipice of shattering. This escalating danger forced Elias to confront the inevitable truth. His past was not merely a shadow, it was a hungry beast, and it had finally caught his scent, threatening to devour not just him, but the innocent lives he had reluctantly sworn to protect. The quiet intimacy of the cottage, once a refuge, now felt like a cage, its walls too thin to withstand the coming storm. The knock came at dusk, heavy and unyielding, a hammer blow against the fragile peace of the cottage. Elias knew instantly who it was. The air crackled with a dreadful certainty, the tension of the past weeks crystallizing into this singular, terrifying moment. He turned to Sarah, his face a mask of grim resolve, but his eyes, for the first time, held a stark, raw vulnerability. "He's here," Elias stated, his voice low and devoid of its usual carefully constructed detachment. Sarah's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. Lily, sensing the shift, clung to her mother's skirt, her small face clouded with apprehension. "Who?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The moment for secrets had evaporated. "A man from my past," Elias began, his voice gravelly, each word a stone dragged from the depths of his being. He didn't offer a full confession, not yet, but enough to explain the immediate threat, enough to shatter the illusion of his simple, mysterious existence. He spoke of a desperate situation, a violent confrontation, a mistake made under duress that had branded him a fugitive, a shadow. "He seeks payment for a debt I couldn't pay, a life I took, though it was in self-defense. They wouldn't see it that way." The words hung heavy, laden with the weight of years of unspoken guilt and profound regret. He saw Sarah flinch, a tremor passing through her. The truth, even a partial one, was brutal, stark. The moral ambiguity of his character, once a silent enigma, was now laid bare, if only in fragments. Her initial reaction was not anger but fear, a chilling understanding of the precarious precipice they now balanced upon. Her child's life, their fragile future, were intertwined with this man's dangerous past. Yet beneath the fear, something else stirred within her, a deeper understanding, perhaps even a nascent empathy for the haunted man standing before her. He was flawed, deeply so, but he had, however reluctantly, become their protector. The choice was stark, unequivocal. Elias could flee, vanish back into the anonymity of the road, leaving them to face the wolf alone. Or he could stand, fight, and risk everything. The cynical voice in his head screamed for flight, for self-preservation. But the sight of Lily's small, trembling hand, of Sarah's desperate, trusting gaze, silenced it. The memory of his own past helplessness, of the absence of a hand to pull him from the brink, solidified his resolve. This was the moment of his pivotal choice, the turning point in the slow-burn narrative. He would not abandon them. The decision was not born of heroism, but of a grim, weary acceptance of responsibility, a profound shift in the very core of his being. He would face his past, not for himself, but for the fragile hope that bloomed in their eyes. The knocking came again, louder this time, a cruel insistence that shattered any lingering illusions of escape. The stage was set for the final brutal confrontation, and Elias, the flawed, morally ambiguous man, stood ready, not for salvation, but for sacrifice. The door shuddered under another forceful blow, the wood groaning a protest that mirrored the tension inside the small cottage. Elias moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, positioning himself between Sarah and Lily and the encroaching threat. His eyes, usually clouded by inner turmoil, were now sharp, focused, reflecting a dangerous resolve. He was no hero, no knight in shining armor, but a cornered animal fighting for the fragile lives unexpectedly entrusted to his care. Thomas, a hulking figure, burst through the door, a cruel sneer twisting his lips, two equally menacing men flanking him. "Elias," Thomas rasped, his voice a low growl. I knew you couldn't stay hidden forever. The world has a way of collecting its debts. His gaze, cold and predatory, swept over Sarah and Lily, an unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. This was the peak of the external conflict, the moment of dramatic confrontation. Elias did not speak, but his posture, tense and coiled, was a silent challenge. He was a man accustomed to violence, to the harsh realities of survival, but his skills were born of desperation, not training. He would not engage them head-on, not with Sarah and Lily so vulnerable. Instead, he relied on cunning, on the shadows and tight spaces of the cottage. A table overturned, a chair thrown to block a doorway, a quick, deceptive feint that sent one of Thomas's men sprawling. It was a desperate ballet of survival, punctuated by the sharp crack of wood, the grunt of effort, the ragged breathing of men locked in a brutal dance. The air grew thick with the scent of fear and exertion. Elias moved with a deceptive grace, using the cramped space to his advantage, his movements economical, precise. He caught Thomas off guard, a sudden lunge, a desperate struggle for a fallen poker. The firelight flickered across their straining faces, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. Thomas, larger and seemingly more formidable, underestimated Elias's desperate will. It was not strength, but a raw, unyielding determination that fueled Elias. A desperate lunge, a sudden, blinding pain as Thomas's fist connected with his jaw, sending him stumbling. But even as he fell, Elias saw his chance. A quick, almost imperceptible shift, a move he had honed in countless street brawls and desperate escapes. He knew he couldn't defeat them outright, but he could create an opening, a diversion. With a final, desperate surge, he sent the heavy wooden chest tumbling, blocking the doorway, buying them precious seconds. "Run!" Elias rasped, his voice choked with pain, his eyes fixed on Sarah. "Get Lily out." His sacrifice was not a grand, heroic act, but a visceral, primal decision to absorb the blow, to buy them escape. He had placed himself squarely in the path of the storm he had once fled, knowing full well the cost. The crashing of the chest, the shouts of Thomas's men, the rising panic in Sarah's eyes. It was a symphony of chaos and desperate heroism. He had made his choice, and now he would pay the price, whatever it might be. The cottage, moments before a battleground, now stood in a jarring silence, punctuated only by Elias's ragged breathing and the distant, fading cries of Thomas and his men. He lay amidst the splintered wood and overturned furniture, a crumpled figure in the dim light. A deep gash bled profusely from his temple, and a sickening ache resonated from his ribs. The physical pain was a dull counterpoint to the searing torment within him, the true wound that bled from his very soul. Sarah, her face stark with terror, rushed to him, her hands trembling as she pressed a makeshift cloth to his wound. Lily, wide-eyed and silent, knelt beside her, a tiny, terrified witness. The chaos had subsided, but the storm within Elias raged. This was the aftermath, raw and unforgiving, and with it came the inevitable truth, the pivotal emotional climax. He was my brother, Elias choked out, his voice hoarse, the words tearing from him like jagged shards of glass. Thomas, my twin brother. The revelation hung in the air, a devastating blow. Sarah gasped, a small pained sound. The irony was brutal, a cruel twist of fate. Elias had not merely fled a debt, but a familial curse, a poisonous legacy. We were different, he continued, his gaze fixed on a distant, unseen point. He chose one path, I another. But the life we lived, it was a shadow, a desperation. I killed a man, not Thomas, another. A man he was trying to ruin. In self-defense, yes, but no one believed me. Not after what Thomas had done, the debts he'd accumulated, the lives he'd destroyed. They branded me, the same name, the same blood. He looked at Sarah then, his eyes pleading for an understanding he knew he might never receive. I fled, not just from the law, but from him, from the darkness that consumed him, that threatened to consume me. He never forgave me for leaving, for not being like him, for not being there for his schemes. He hunted me, not for the debt, but for revenge, for abandoning him. The truth, delivered in broken fragments, was a heavy shroud exposing the deeply flawed, morally ambiguous man beneath the hardened exterior. Sarah, hearing the confession, felt a wave of conflicting emotions: shock, horror, a profound sadness. Her protector, the man who had reluctantly stepped into their lives, was not just a drifter, but a fugitive, a man haunted by fratricidal resentment and a shadowed past that bled into his very present. Lily, listening with an almost preternatural understanding, reached out a small, hesitant hand, touching Elias's bloodied temple. Her innocence, her unwavering trust, was a stark contrast to the ugliness of his confession. This was the moment of complete vulnerability, the raw, unvarnished truth laid bare. Elias had confronted not just his brother, but his own internal demons, the very source of his cynicism, his detachment, his lifelong flight. The quiet pain of his past, the haunting echoes of the choices he had made, now resonated in the cramped cottage, filling every corner with its chilling presence. The battle was over, but the war within him had just begun. The raw truth of Elias's confession hung heavy in the air, a stark, unyielding presence. Sarah's initial shock slowly yielded to a profound, almost crushing understanding. She looked at the man before her, his face streaked with blood and the raw anguish of his unveiled past, and saw not just a fugitive, but a deeply wounded soul. The villain, the morally ambiguous stranger, was suddenly human, tragically so. Her own life had taught her the bitter lessons of desperation, of choices made under duress, of the long shadows that past mistakes could cast. She saw the irony in it all. She, a woman whose world had been shattered by the indifference of others, was now faced with a man whose own life was a tapestry of suffering and flight. Forgiveness was a complex, arduous path, not a sudden, effortless leap. She felt the tremor of fear, the instinct to recoil from the violence and darkness that clung to his history. But then she looked at Lily, her daughter's small hand still resting gently on Elias's temple, a silent testament to an innocent, unquestioning faith. Lily saw the protector, the one who had driven the shadows away, and in her eyes Sarah saw a reflection of a different kind of truth, a truth that transcended the harsh judgments of society, the relentless pursuit of the past. It was a truth woven from resilience and an innate capacity for compassion. The community, with its gossiping whispers and judgmental glances, seemed to fade into the background, their collective opinions rendered irrelevant by the raw, visceral reality of their shared moment. Their world had shrunk to this cottage, to these three fragile lives intertwined by fate and desperate circumstances. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. Her hand, hesitant at first, covered Elias's, pressing gently. It was not a grand gesture, but a quiet, powerful acknowledgement. "We are here," she said, her voice soft but firm, a beacon in the storm. "We are here now." It was her unspoken absolution, her fragile offering of acceptance, a silent promise to navigate the murky waters of his past alongside him. The heavy burden of his solitary existence, of years spent fleeing, seemed to lighten, if only infinitesimally. He saw the shift in her eyes, the softening of her resolve, and a painful, unfamiliar emotion swelled in his chest. It was not joy, but a profound, almost terrifying sense of belonging, a connection he had ruthlessly denied himself for so long. This was the resolution of his internal conflict, a halting step towards healing. The darkness was still there. The shadows of Thomas and his deeds would forever haunt him, but a sliver of light, fragile yet persistent, had found its way into the cracks of his hardened heart. Hope, not a blinding, optimistic burst, but a quiet, grounded possibility, began to emerge from the lingering darkness of their collective trauma. The promise of a new beginning, not clean or unblemished, but authentic, earned through shared suffering and quiet endurance, seemed to flicker in the dim light of the cottage. The quiet of the cottage settled over them, a different kind of quiet now, one imbued with the lingering scent of smoke and the profound weight of unspoken understanding. Elias, his wounds slowly mending, no longer looked at the door with the same restless fear, nor at Sarah with the same guarded distance. The scars of his past, the internal ones, remained. They were etched deep into his being, a constant reminder of the choices made, the price paid. He would forever carry the memory of Thomas, of the dark reflection he saw in his brother's eyes, a chilling testament to the life he had so desperately tried to escape. But now, those scars did not define him. They were part of his story, woven into the intricate tapestry of a life unexpectedly redeemed. Sarah, too, bore her own scars, invisible but potent. The loss, the struggle, the constant threat of destitution. These had shaped her, made her resilient, capable of a profound, quiet strength. She moved through the small space with a renewed purpose, her eyes holding a deeper light. Lily, ever observant, sensed the shift. Her laughter, once a fragile bell, now rang with a clearer, more confident tone. She no longer begged for a father, for Elias had become something more profound, a steadfast presence, an anchor in their stormy world. He was not the husband her mother truly married, not in the traditional sense, but a man who had chosen to stay, to protect, to build something new from the wreckage of his own life and theirs. The cottage, once a temporary refuge, began to feel like a home. The crooked window he had mended, the sturdy firewood he chopped, the quiet moments spent watching Lily draw in the dust. These small acts were the bricks of their new foundation. There were no grand pronouncements of love, no sweeping gestures. Their bond was forged in the crucible of shared adversity, a grounded, authentic connection born of necessity and evolving into a quiet, enduring affection. The future was not without its shadows. The world outside remained harsh, and the whispers of the village would likely persist. But they faced it together, a fragile, unlikely unit. Elias was no longer a phantom, no longer a man running from his own reflection. He was Elias, a man with a past he could not erase, but a present he had chosen, a future he was willing to build, brick by painful brick. The setting sun cast long golden shadows through the small window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a silent, symbolic dance of endurance and renewal. It was not a fairy tale ending, but a deeply human one, steeped in the complexities of life, death, and the enduring power of an unexpected connection. The raw, emotional truth of their struggle had given way to a quiet, hopeful resolution, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The plea of a little girl had not just saved her mother, it had inadvertently saved a man, bringing him from the endless road into the quiet, challenging embrace of a fragile, yet undeniable home.